I am very pleased to introduce Melissa Tully, who is an associate professor and director of undergraduate studies in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa. She earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Melissa teaches classes on digital and social media and conducts research related to news literacy and engagement on social media in the United States and Kenya. And she's going to talk with us today about journalism in troubled times, how journalists and audiences respond to contemporary challenges. Please welcome Melissa Tully.
Thank you. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. All right, let me look here. All right, I know how much time I have. Okay, so I just wanted to start out today with a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to try to move through these things kind of quickly so we have a lot of time for conversation. But I do want to start out with some context in the United States and globally. So as you heard from my bio, I do work in East Africa as well. So if anyone wants to talk about that later, we can. But I will give you some sort of global context. And I'll warn you that this first part is not pleasant when we talk about the sort of risks and challenges to journalists in this country and around the world. But I do promise there is some good news. Then I'll talk a little bit more about journalists and journalism education, and what I mean there is sort of the future journalists. So the folks, the students that I work with, and kind of their role, our role as media creators. And then I will spend more time, though, however, on audiences and news consumption, because that's us. I don't suspect most of you are journalists. Maybe some of you are, but most of us engage with the news this way. And so I want to talk about what that means for us, what our role is, how we can perhaps be more positive contributors in our current news environment, and where civic engagement really comes into play. So for me, most of my research actually is in this area, is in audiences and news consumption. But I get the privilege and pleasure of teaching journalism students, so I kind of get that from my teaching side. So I'm happy, especially in the Q&A, to talk a little bit more about that interplay. So let me start out with a few images. So this probably is not surprising to any of you if you follow the president at all, or if you watch TV at all. You know that he has the tendency to tweet and say things that really paint the media, and he usually says the mainstream media, or he'll pick a specific news organization, CNN's a fave, to target. And he uses very deliberate targeting language, right? So calling the media fake, calling it the enemy of the people. This is something that he's been doing for a while. I think this screen grab is from 2017 or 2018, and he hasn't really let up. He switches who he talks about, and he switches the context and various things, but this is the kind of language we're hearing from the tippity top. And so it should come as no surprise that it's filtered down to other politicians, and it's filtered down into our everyday dialogue and conversation. So I think it's important to keep this in mind. He is still an important figure, and what he says matters. So if we look around the world, and I'm going to give you some stats from some organizations that I think do a really good job of collecting data and presenting that data back to us on these issues of journalism globally. So the World Press Freedom Index is compiled by Reporters Without Borders, a really great organization that cares about protecting the actual people who do this work. Because if we remember, the president attacks these organizations as if they're just like this box of nothing. These are real people, right, who work there, and their lives are actually something that I think we should value, whether or not you agree with them. And so this report comes out every year, so you can see changes over time, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to bore you with the statistics, the percentage change. But what they tell us, what we can learn from this report, is that there is more violence against journalists now, globally. In the United States, there is actual violence against journalists, but also importantly, people feel threatened. So there's the perception that they are at risk. This is another organization, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. So this is United States data, and this tracks over the year each year what sort of happened. And these numbers are not actually all that high. 2018 was a really bad year. I don't know if people recall, there were 4 journalists killed in Maryland. In the United States, the murder of journalists, luckily, is very rare. So that really did strike a chord with people. So this year we've had 0 journalists killed in the United States, which is obviously excellent. But this organization kind of tracks the more what we might think of as kind of mundane types of pressures that journalists face. So you can see there have been journalists attacked, 34, but also denials of access, stopped at border, these various things that journalists face. So to me, these pressures are kind of with journalists all the time. They are not going to get the splashy attention, though, because nobody really wants to, hear about how a journalist was denied a subpoena or whatever it might be. So these are still important, and this is a really good resource as well. So if anyone's interested in this kind of stuff more broadly, I'm happy to share these sites. I want to talk a little bit more about this country and Canada because I think we tend to have this perspective that's very US-centric, which I think is okay. And in this case, it gives us our neighbors to the north as well. And this is specifically about female and non-binary journalists. And it's extremely important that we look, when we talk about media professionals, we do not talk about them in aggregate. It should come as no surprise to you that women, people of color, face more challenges than men, white men particularly. So when we start looking at what women face in this field, you can see that online harassment is a huge risk. It's a huge felt risk. They feel that that's really a danger. And in this is a pie graph that is astounding to me, that this is a question that asks, have journalists been more or less safe in the past few years? 84% say less safe. Okay? Now again, this is perception, right? This isn't based on doing the statistically significant difference between attacks in this year and attacks in this year, right? But this matters. If we're talking about encouraging young people to go into this field, which is what I do, and if you know anything about media or journalism schools, we are predominantly female. My students are predominantly female, like 70–80%, okay? So women want to get into media and they want to do this work. And if I show them this and leave them with this, that would be irresponsible. So I think it's our job to tackle these things. And one thing that is positive is we are starting to, as a society and as professionals, we're starting to take online harassment much more seriously. For a long time, it was sort of just, ignore that, just block them. But we've realized now that sometimes, one, it can actually lead to psychological issues for the journalists, but oftentimes it translates into offline behavior. And then one more sad slide before I get to the happier ones. This is just that global index that I was telling you about. Red's not good. So if you just want a quick look, red and black are very bad, and orangish is in the middle. So yellow and white are good. So globally, it's not great. This is where I spend most of my time, and this is where I spend other parts of my time. So I'm not always in the best media environments. But this is just to give you a broad picture of the kind of environment that journalists face, and the kind of environment that I face when I talk to parents of 18 to 20-year-olds who want to go into journalism school, and what I have to talk to them about. And I would be remiss if I didn't engage with these issues. But I think there is still a lot to be excited about, and there are a lot of opportunities for journalists. One, there are jobs. Despite what you might have been told, there are lots of jobs. In fact, there are jobs that will exist 6 months, 1 year, 2 years from now that I don't know what they are because they do not yet exist. Right? When students start freshman, sophomore year in journalism majors, they often end up with jobs that they didn't know were a thing, and neither did we. And it's not because we're not paying attention, it's because the pace of change in the industry is vast. In addition, there are jobs in organizations, nonprofits, all these places that we now consider journalism jobs, right? Journalism isn't just done by the Gazette right over there, right? It's done by all sorts of people and places. So if we start to think about jobs very broadly, we see there's a lot of opportunities to be a media creator, to do journalism, to produce news. In fact, about 95 to 97% of our graduates have jobs within 6 months in their field. So that's a good thing, but again, they're going into jobs that are potentially risky, so we do have to talk to them about that and about how to protect themselves. Innovation. This is something I am really excited about because this is something I teach. So how we as media educators and media professionals can be at the forefront of digital innovation. So we've sort of given a lot of power, too much in fact, which I'll talk about later, to social media companies and big tech to be the leaders in innovation. And what we're seeing now, and I think it's a really good thing, is that media companies and media professionals are saying, whoa, 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 we do this too, and we can do a really good job, and we actually might do it with some morals, or at least some commitment to a civic society. And so I think there's a lot of innovation happening, and there's a lot of actual interest by donors and other kinds of folks to invest in journalism and invest in media. And I think that's super exciting. So there are jobs, there are innovations, there are opportunities. And for our purposes, we still matter, and we still actually, despite what you might think, we still consume news. And we still consume different kinds of journalism. One thing that we know, however, and this is from a recent publication that comes out of the UK, is that we want news that we think is relevant. We have gotten, all of us, right, have gotten so used to on-demand everything, and we want things that make sense for us, give us what we need, and that's true of journalism as well. So we want news that actually matters to our lives. This is a shift in thinking for the producers of news. They have not thought about audiences in this way until the last about 15 years. And that's short in the lifespan of how long we've been doing this. For the longest time, it was sort of, no, we give you what you need, right? We give you what you need. You have to learn about this. You have to learn about that. And we're starting to take seriously the audience as a true space of knowledge, and as telling us things. Like if people say, I need news about this or that, we should believe them. This is kind of new. In fact, journalists and media professionals for a long time thought they knew better than you. Right? So we need to push them on this. Don't be afraid to push them on this. So let me tell you a little bit about audiences. And again, this is us. But I want to tell you a little bit about some of the global trends. So if you're thinking about this, and maybe when you see things that might surprise you. Around the world, people spend more time on WhatsApp. If you don't know what WhatsApp is, that's okay. It's a closed chat app. It's kind of like a large messenger, like any kind of text messenger you would use. But in other countries, people spend more time on WhatsApp and closed chat apps than this country. We don't do that as much here. But hey, we are not the center of the world, despite what we might think. And however, Facebook, though, is still the most important source of news globally. Okay, again, here we hear things like, oh, young people have moved on to this or that other thing. In many parts of the world, we say things like Facebook is the internet. And that still remains true. And Facebook owns WhatsApp. And Facebook owns Instagram. And Facebook is very influential with regulators around the world. So they are a major global player. We can never let them off the hook. Concerns about misinformation and disinformation are high. That should say are high. Concerns are high. This is true, again, around the world, in some countries more than others. For example, this comes from a global survey. Brazil, there are a lot of fears about mis and disinformation. UK and US, we're still up there. That's high. That's high. We're fearful. Journalists are fearful. Politicians are fearful, right? If I could pick a word that describes the contemporary moment, it would be fear. However, silver lining, this worry is starting to translate into some good things for actual credible quality news organizations. So some of the data is suggesting that worries about this kind of just bonkers media environment where stuff is traveling and getting picked up and spread and shared and all that has actually made people say, whoa, maybe we should go back to those people that we trust. Maybe New York Times has something good to say. And so across countries, we're seeing that now this isn't a huge number, but it's a change. This is a change across countries that people are relying on what they perceive to be reputable. Again, we can get into what that means for example, partisans. But what people think reputable sources are, and this is rising. It rose to 40% in the US. Okay? So what this means is we've realized that there's a lot of garbage, and we're trying to go back to those sources that we trust. So it's a good opportunity for traditional and more mainstream news outlets to actually work with their audiences and build that trust. They cannot go back to that, oh, see, we know what's best for you, right? They still need to build those relationships, what I was talking about earlier. So because trust is still generally low. So we're fearful, we're distrustful, and people are taking advantage of that. So one way that people take advantage of that is by the creation of misinformation, which is often called fake news. We in the sort of scholarly community don't really use this term, but we use it to get headlines. So we're just as bad as anybody else, right? Because we know that if we say our study looks at fake news, it's more likely to then get covered by the media. The media loves to talk about itself. And so in my world, we call this misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, right? The kind of content that is created with different intentions. We can talk about intentions later, but it tricks us. And what we're seeing, and these are just some headlines from about studies. So a study on the largest ever study of fake news at the time, this is almost a year old, they travel faster. These stories travel faster. They're more sensational, right? They have sort of characteristics that make them appealing. And there's this other, and of course it appeals to our emotions, there's this other trend that if you hear something repeated enough times, you start to believe it, right? So it's really tapping into our sort of cognitive functions. And that can be alarming, but the positive side is we are spending a lot of time and effort to try to figure this out and to figure out how to combat it. And that's where I think we come into play as well. So how did we actually get to this place? And I'm going to run through these really fast so that we have enough time. This one you all probably know. Changes in technology that affect news, right? We get our news from social media. We all do. Even y'all, right? And it's a fast-growing space. And actually, it grows for every demographic. This, though, I always call this graphic the we drink from the poison well graphic. We're getting our news there, and we're saying we think it's inaccurate. Why are we doing that? Right? We are social media. Without us, there's no content, right? So we can actually change that. There's lack of trust. I was just talking about this. Again, don't worry about all the graphics, but essentially we don't trust the news, and we don't trust other organizations. The revenue models are designed to help the platforms and not help us. So this is a screen grab that I think really captures what that means. This is an ad that ran on YouTube, and it ran, the ad you can see, it's the Nissan Tomorrow to Today series. Look at the people in this ad, right? So this is an ad that features a diverse group of people. It ran before a video that I don't think Nissan would really want their ad running in front of. A video from David Duke. Why did that happen? It's not because Nissan made an ad buy there. It's the way that the algorithms in Google put their ads in places based on clicks. I can talk about programmatic advertising and all that later. But essentially, Google doesn't care. They want your money. And that video gets clicks. And Nissan told them, only put our ad with videos that get clicks. And it's not until people started pointing this out that there was a pushback. Okay, so revenue models are not our friends. Capitalism, right? Political polarization, I don't have to tell anybody in this room that political polarization is high. This, again, don't even worry about what the issues are. Red is Republican, blue is Democrat. We're not close on anything, on issues we care about. Even the closest ones aren't that close. Violent crime is the only one that's close. And the area that I really care about, we don't have good news, information, and media literacy. We, all of us, everybody. It takes work to build those skills and to actually practice them. So this is from last year. 63% of people in this survey say they have trouble telling real from fake. I tell you, it's a lot higher than that, because think about it. This is a survey where people are admitting it. 58% of Americans, again, this is all recent data, this is from 2018, 2019, say it's harder to stay informed now than ever before because we have too much information, right? So we're living in an environment that is really just saturated, right? So all of these things contribute. So don't let anyone tell you, oh, it's technology, oh, it's this, oh, no, it's all of these things. And there are more, and we could talk about other things that contribute as well. But if we think about these things together, you sort of get a snapshot of where we are and potentially where we're going. Because I think all of those things are changeable. Some harder than others. Don't ask me how to change political polarization. Why does this matter? Some real world consequences. I'll just give you a couple examples. Misinformation has negative implications for democracy. I think you know that. If people have bad information, they make bad decisions. It's just kind of how it goes. And we don't make this might surprise you, we don't make all of our decisions rationally. So if we're given bad information that supports our pre-existing beliefs, which may be also wrong, we just got evidence to support what we wanted to do. This is from the last midterm elections. From the New York Times, they asked people to submit examples of misinformation, and readers submitted more than 40,000 things that they came across, right? 4,000, sorry. 4,000 examples, just of stuff that they came across in their feeds, right? Threats and violence against individuals and groups we have seen around the world. India was a big example a year or so ago where people were actually getting killed over misinformation that was spreading, on a lot of it on WhatsApp. Particularly misinformation around kidnappings and other kinds of violence, so falsely identifying people as criminals. And public and individual health. This is an area where I actually do a lot of work and how we make decisions about our own health based on misinformation. So this is good information. This is from the CDC. But there's a whole, if you go to the CDC, there are fact sheets like this to debunk health misinformation about almost everything. And the flu is a big one. So there's lots of misconceptions about the flu. And last year it was rampant because last year's flu vaccine wasn't that effective compared to how effective they usually are. And so there was tons of misinformation. I did some research on that last year. But these have consequences for us. So what can journalists do? One, we can elevate the quality of journalism. We are not blameless, right? We have contributed to this. The desire for clicks, those advertising models have made journalists and news organizations try to be the quickest out the gate, try to do those snappy headlines, right? So we need to do a better job. So in our journalism courses, we talk a lot about evidence, verification, sourcing, old school journalism, how you do journalism. And we can do that. We can elevate that quality. This is really important, and this is something that's getting more attention. We actually, as media creators and news organizations, can differentiate kinds of content. It's confusing to see news story, opinion piece, column, whatever it is, and not know what that actually means. So for example, this is from the Virginian Pilot, a newspaper in Virginia. They have put out explainers on what their things are. That didn't take a lot. Talk about the most evergreen content you could ever create. And they could link it in every single story, right? So we can explain to people, when it says analysis, this is what it means. When it says AP, it came from The Wire. People don't know that, and you should not be expected to. It's our job to tell you, right? This is where you get in this trouble of people posting opinion pieces as if they're fact. We should be transparent, right? We're asking a lot of you to trust us, and we should be transparent about what we know, what we don't know, how we made decisions. One place I think that this happens really well is the New York Times. If you listen to any podcasts, The Daily is a great news podcast. One, it goes in depth into one story every day, but they also tell you about how they did the reporting, which I find really useful. So then you can say, I actually don't think that was a good way to do that reporting, or I do. So this is an example of just the journalist explaining what I see in my reporting, how she got her sources, in fact. That's new. Journalists for the longest time, right, do their thing, put it out there. I also keep this up for the idea of developing expertise. We can help our future journalists become experts. There is a desire for expertise. We live in a sort of society in which experts are both at the same time we're craving them, and at the same time they're sort of being pushed back on. But if you can develop true expertise, like this reporter, you can actually make good money, which is important too. So developing expertise and taking these opportunities. And then the last one for journalists, we need to be innovators. So I always tell people, you know, you hear all this Russian hackers, this hacker, that hacker. The bad guys are always one step ahead. It's true, like what you see in like a villain movie, right? Hackers are good at technology. That's like the essence of what they do. So we, as if the quote unquote good guys, need to embrace these new technologies, embrace these skills. We have to be able to get ahead. We have to. They're always one step ahead. There's a reason that banks are constantly being hacked, right? The people who want to do this kind of stuff are experts. They're just using their powers for evil. So we could use our powers for good. So there's a big push, for example, in news organizations to have really, really, really good tech people who can actually do things like scrape data, do all these kinds of analysis, and actually get ahead of the game. So I think this is important. This is the kind of stuff I talk about with my students to prepare them to go into this world. But what should we do? We can do a lot. We can put in a little effort. I call this the effort slide, right? We got to try a little too. We should actually check where the stuff is coming from. Seems simple, but it's not. And it's meant to be difficult. It is meant to be difficult. There is a reason that everything looks equally important on Facebook. That's what Facebook wants. They want to keep you there. They want to keep you scrolling. They want you to think, you're engaging. If they really wanted you to know, they could do it. Okay? So you need to verify. You need to click on links. You need to think about, why is this person doing this? Question motives at all times. And then, after you've done such a thing, which literally can only take you 30 seconds, read it. I'm not going to make you raise your hands, but think in your head, if you've ever shared something anywhere, Facebook, with a friend, that you didn't actually read fully, right? Actually read the thing and then share it carefully. Like, check the URL, look for signs of actual journalism. Here's an easy sign of actual journalism. Are there sources? A lot of quote unquote fake news has no sourcing, right? Look for sources. Look for actual direct quotes. Look for links to documents, things like that. Read critically, and then be careful. This is what when I say we are social media, I mean there would literally be no content if we didn't create it and share it. So if you do this, you're creating social media, and it's up to you then to make good decisions about what you share. And then when in doubt, don't share. That's just don't do it. Weigh the evidence. Again, if it's real journalism, there'll be evidence, and you can decide what's what. So determine what the claims are. Are they actually supported? Again, a lot of shoddy reporting or a lot of shoddy journalism they have claims with no data, claims with no evidence. So look for this kind of stuff. It will take you more time, but it's worth it, I think. Vet the author. We should not assume that every person every time is doing good or evil, but we should look into them. Oftentimes we can figure out what they're all about, right? They have Twitter bios, they have Twitter pages. The social media thing can give us insight into who these folks are. So consider their biases, their interests, their credibility. As I said, there are a lot more jobs, right, in journalism, but a lot of those journalism jobs are not in traditional news industries. They may be at think tanks or nonprofits or partisan, not being bad partisan, just people with opinions partisan. So why are they creating that story? A lot of it can be really, really good, but you should keep that in mind. And the most important and the most difficult, that's why I put it at number 5, acknowledge your own biases. Your own beliefs, your own emotions. You, me, all of us have them. That's what makes us human, right? So we have to consider how our beliefs influence our interpretation of news. There is decades of research in this area. I can go on and on if you would like, about how we could all read the same story and depending on our worldviews have different interpretations, right? There are things like political partisanship that really, really matter for how we read and interpret. But ask yourself, why am I feeling this way? Like, why am I so mad about this? Because sometimes it's you, but sometimes it's them trying to make you mad, right? So if we actually acknowledge our role, this is a lot. This doesn't take 5 minutes. This takes a lot more work on us to think about what we're doing and why we're perpetuating certain things, or how we can be a good citizen. These kinds of things are quicker, but they're important. And I always tell people, you don't have to do this for everything. You could literally not, you would waste all of your life and all of your time. But find the things you care about, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things, depending upon how much time you have, and do that work for those things. Jump in the conversation. It is, if, for example, if you see someone posting something that is wrong, it is okay to correct them. I know, the Midwest, right? Iowa nice, throw it away. Correct them. You can update people's attitudes. You can. And more importantly, you can influence other people in that social network. I can talk more about that in the Q&A as well. So we all have a role to play, and I think we can all do it. So I will leave you with that, so we have time for a and I would love your feedback. Thank you.
That I will bring the microphone around to you, so catch my eye with your hand. I have 2 already, and then I will come to you.
Thank you, and I really appreciate your telling us what to do. And I have some questions.
Yes.
One, is there an agreed upon ethics code for digital media?
So it is our habit that I will bring the microphone around to you, so catch my eye with your hand. I have 2 already, and then I will come to you.
Thank you, and I really appreciate your telling us what to do, but I have some questions. One, is there an agreed upon ethics code
Yeah, it's
for
a great question. The short answer is no.
Digital media.
No.
2, if there is,
no, that's not true. There actually are. So every news
organizations,
organization has a code of ethics. 100%, and you should be able to find that
3,
online. Like
if there
that
is
should
some
be available
kind of
to you.
standard
But in
an
general, for
an
example,
organization
individuals and
has,
organizations
why
can
isn't
become
there some kind
members of the Society of
good
Professional
housekeeping
Journalists. That's the
seal
premier
so that
organization for journalists.
we can go
They have a
to
code
it
of
and say,
ethics.
this is
For example,
what
in the
they agree to
journalism
do.
school, we have a code of ethics that all of our students sign. It's heavily based on the Society of Professional Journalists code of ethics. So yes, there is a code of ethics. Does it relate to all digital outfits? No. Right? So because of this, and this is partially the sort of culture of the internet, and this idea that the internet comes out of sort of a libertarian, right, idea, and this idea that good information will come to the top and blah blah. But that's the sort of ethos of the internet. So the notion that there would be one ethical framework in which all media creators would operate just would never fly in a digital space. So there isn't one, but there are lots. So Society of Professional Journalists is one. Public Relations has its own. PRSA, Public Relations Society of America is one. Advertising has its own. But these, again, are all sort of traditional, right? So if you're in an org, like New York Times, NPR, IPR, whatever it is, you will subscribe to these things. Individual media creators, however, have a lot more flexibility. In this country, you do not have to be licensed to be a journalist, right? You don't have to sign any documents. So I think that it is quite difficult. In terms of the list of like where you should go, there have been attempts by organizations to do that, to say like New York Times in general does a good job or whatever it might be. They still mess up. Of course, individuals mess up. But again, that has become one of those things that is somehow partisan. Information is partisan, right? Facts are partisan these days. So you can find these, and there's these really interesting, and I can share them, I don't have one with me, these folks who do like these grids, and they'll put like left to right on the grid and sort of mainstream to, and then they plot news organizations. So there are these attempts to do that, but I think what I tell people, and I think this is true, is you don't need to read everything from everywhere. Again, figure out the issues you care about. Find the 3 to 5 sources that you think cover that issue really well. Curate your own list. Start with some of the ones, you don't have to recreate the wheel. Start with some that are trusted news organizations. It's okay to be like, I'm gonna get my news from NPR. That's fine, start there. And then you can start moving around in other spaces and figuring out what's good quality. I always recommend you do engage with partisan media on both sides, or wherever you fit. Because you need to know what the arguments are. And guess what? Sometimes you're wrong and they're right. And it's good to know, and it's good to be, it also gives you, if you want to have a debate, it gives you good fodder for your debates. So no, there's not one list, but there are places that you can kind of figure that out and kind of curate your own list of what's quality.
You mentioned that there are jobs for people, but can they afford to take them? I mean, the median entry level salary, well, I don't know if it's median or median, but average salary for an entry level reporter in Iowa is like $21,000. Any of us who watch television in this market or read the Gazette have seen any number of entry level reporters say for one contract.
You mentioned that there are jobs for people, but can they afford to take them? I mean, the median entry-level salary, well, I don't know if it's median or mean, but average salary for an entry-level reporter in Iowa is like $21,000. Any of us who watch television in this market or read the Gazette have seen any number of entry-level reporters stay for one contract, and then they can't afford to pay their rent, and then they go into public relations. You know, and there's not much headroom. The top level journalists in this state don't make six figures.
Your spirit, I don't know.
And that's true
local
nationally
news is the
to
place in
greater or
which there is the
lesser
biggest
extent.
need.
So,
you are 100% correct.
you know,
Local,
if we don't
everybody knows
compensate-
newsrooms
and
have
what's
been
more is the
slash
size of the
trash,
staffs are
bought
shrinking.
out, repackaged,
You know,
whatever.
it used to be a one-man band in radio shops,
however,
and now
the
they have to do
notion
their
that
radio
because someone is
newscasts
in a
and
job
maintain the
for a
website
year and then
and put out
changes
a
jobs
newsletter.
and then changes jobs
So
and changes jobs, that is
can
not
you
just a
afford
journalism or
either
media problem.
monetarily
That is
or in your spirit to
the
take
world
these
we live
jobs?
in now. So I think one thing we need, and we talk to students about this, and we talk to parents about this, and we talk to the old boys club in journalism about this. People do not go to the Gazette and stay there. They just don't. They are moving up, and they're going to move. And people change jobs 4 to 5 times in a 6-year cycle. And that is just the way it is, and that is true across industries. It's even true in PR and digital and all these places. People are just moving, and oftentimes they are there to get those clips so they can move, and so they can move. That doesn't help us, right? That doesn't make it feel any better, especially when we're talking about the local news we really care about. So 100% these folks need to be paid better. Yes, 100%. But I don't think we should take changing jobs as an indicator of dying journalism. It's shifting, and the models are going to continue. I don't know the business model. If I did, I would not be here. I'll tell you what, I'd be rich myself. Nobody knows the business model. There's lots of testing going on with different paid models, for example. One thing that I think is really cool, and actually Iowa is doing this, is shared resources models, where like a nonprofit journalism model, like Iowa Watch, something like that, and they can partner and then sell stories. It's kind of like it's not freelancing because it's not individual, but it's sort of like a collaborative or a collective. That to me has great potential because you can, one, put resources together to pay people better, but also better stories, right? So I actually feel relatively confident that news organizations are starting to see that they can't just be siloed. They have to work together. And that's across, again, multiple industries, but that's happening. So it's gonna look different. But yeah, no one can live off of $20,000, and that definitely needs to change. And I think we're gonna see that people pushing back, right? Again, this is kind of talking with your dollars too. Pushing back, putting your money where you think there's quality journalism will change that game a little bit. It's not going to be quick, and it's going to be ugly, and it's going to take some time. But I absolutely think there are jobs that you can, and there are jobs that actually do lift your spirits. But journalism is being done in all sorts of weird places, so we need to keep our eyes and minds open for that.
We're going to see that people pushing back, right? Again, this is kind of talking with your dollars too.
I tend to use Wikipedia a lot. And I'm always amazed at how timely it is. A person's name pops up in the news, and I want to find out who this person is back then. And I'm wondering, what is the feeling about Wikipedia? Can I believe everything I read there? And they talk about constantly.
I tend to use Wikipedia a lot, and
I would say that I'm always amazed at how timely it is. A person's
I would never
name
say to be
pops up in the
suspicious.
news,
I
and
think
want to find out
suspicion
who
and
this person
cynicism
is
has gotten us
back.
where we are. I would
And
say be
I'm
skeptical,
wondering
not of Wikipedia
what
just
is
as like,
the,
I think Wikipedia is great, actually. And
feeling
like you
about
just described, if
Wikipedia.
you're like,
Can
oh,
I believe
who's so-and-so,
everything I read there?
oh,
And
there's
they-
so-and-so. And if all
and
you
they
need to
talk
know is
about
like what this person's
constantly
title is in their job,
taking
boom,
criticism
done, move
and
on. You don't have
making
to go and
changes, but,
fact check all of that. I think
would
Wikipedia,
say
though,
that
should not be,
probably I
if it's
should
an important
be much
issue,
more
you're trying to learn
suspicious
about,
of
for
what I read
example,
there.
the impeachment hearings or something. You should not stop at Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is a creation of people. It's a people-powered system, right? So again, those biases that I talked about, they're in Wikipedia. So what we need to do is start with Wikipedia and then start moving to other sources. Again, you having those few sources that you trust. If it's, again, do not do this for everything, right? Like, not everything, one, not everything matters. But two, you don't have that much time. If it's an issue you care about, though, I 100% think going to Wikipedia first is okay. And then kind of moving on. It's the same question that I get about Google. Google is also, or Bing or whatever you use, is loaded with bias because algorithms are created by people and you can pay to move up in search results, right? So none of these platforms are neutral. And so we need to do a little bit more. So again, if it's something you really want to learn about, I would take 2 or 3 extra steps, not 25 extra steps, 2 or 3. Especially if you can get back to if it's something where there's like an original source document, probably only take you 3 clicks to get there. So that's what I always tell people is that all of these things are built on people-powered resources. So we should do a little bit more on our end as well. I can go on and on about how Wikipedia editors, for example, delete the bios of women scientists. It's just a known thing, right? And so there's a lot of sexism and racism embedded in Wikipedia because the editors tend to be white men. So we need to start thinking about these things. There's a lot of sexism and racism embedded in algorithms. So these are the kinds of things, if we know about that, we can say, oh, I'm going to take one more step. That's it. I don't think you need 25 steps, couple extra steps. Hi.
2 things. I rely on Snopes.
Mm-hmm.
Should I? And is there anything analogous to Snopes? Because to me, that's the gold standard.
Do you want to describe what that is for people who don't know, or do you want me to? Okay, so it's like Snopes. So they debunk, they fact check. It's basically, if you see something on the internet, kind of like Wikipedia, you can go there and they probably have already told you if it's real or not real. There are lots of fact checking and debunking sites. PolitiFact for politics is a really good one. There's global ones. So for example, I mentioned I do work in East Africa. There's one called Africa Check. So there's all these kind of fact checking organizations. I think that they're really useful. Especially, again, if it's those issues you care about. Sometimes it's just fun to look at them because you see like a wild image and you're like, there's no way that, you know, an elephant is in Cedar Rapids or whatever, and it's silly. But for like political issues and things like, and then some of the mainstream papers as well do decent fact checks, like Washington Post, New York Times, Gazette. So I think fact checks are really, really great. Again, they're being produced by organizations with certain inclinations. So kind of reading 2 fact checks is really interesting too, because you can kind of see what they picked. You know, it's really easy to debunk like a statistical claim, right? If someone says 52% of XYZ and the number is 32%, that's really easy. But it's harder to kind of fact check and debunk complex claims. And so when you read these different fact checking sites, you'll see kind of where they. So I absolutely would say use those sites. I use them all the time. And again, for those issues that matter, I would use PolitiFact. I would use any of those fact-checking websites because it's going to just give you, even if you don't agree with what they come down as the facts, it'll give you a little more data and knowledge.
It ends a lot of arguments.
Absolutely.
Because I throw up Snopes, but do they have a bias?
Yeah, I'm sure they do. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I personally am not a Snopes expert, but all of these sites have bias, and what's really interesting is that even the quote-unquote nonpartisan, politically nonpartisan sites, people perceive them as biased. So it doesn't even matter, right? They could literally have done, for example, if you want to think about a simple problem, if they had 100 fact checks to do and 50% were on liberal side and 50% were on the conservative side. They treated them exactly the same amount of words, same amount of resources, equally came down on true, not true for each side. And you ask people what their bias is, they're going to say the one that's often not their side. So political fact checks, especially now, conservatives tend to think that they're biased against them. Sure. Partially because a lot of the false claims right now are coming from that side. It's not because that's always the case. It just kind of is right now. So one thing to think about if you share that stuff is you might get that pushback. That someone might say, that's actually a biased site. That's actually fake news. So being ready to engage with that. One thing we found in our research, I do research on correcting people online. Wild world. But if you do post a link to a reputable source or one in which your community thinks is reputable, that'll get you what you need. So if people in your space respond to that, keep on keeping on. I would never tell you to not do that. But posting like the CDC, for example, or the FDA, that still works. Even though we don't trust politicians or most government, we still trust those places. So use those things. Link to the original data, whatever it is. Absolutely use that stuff because then you're doing the thing that the journalist should do. You're using evidence.
A few weeks ago, Bloomberg News announced, after Michael Bloomberg announced for presidency, that they would not be doing any investigative reporting on Michael or any of the Democratic candidates, but they would be doing investigative reporting on the president.
Yep.
My question is this a teachable moment for journalism? Or do we just say thank you for your honesty and move on, knowing that this is going to be the way of the future in journalism?
I think it's both. I think it's definitely a teachable moment because I actually do appreciate their transparency. I don't like any of it. I don't like what's happening. So I think it's important to talk about it and for students to talk about media ownership, for example, that a fellow like Mike Bloomberg has his, well, it's called Bloomberg News, so that one's obvious, right? But has his fingers in lots of different things, and to talk about conflict of interest, right? Talk about, for example, the sort of the notion that like Jeff Bezos, right, owns the Washington Post. All of these ideas that these rich people are extremely powerful, and their power, and they know the media is important, right? So they're using their power, Murdochs, whatever. We have lots of examples. So I absolutely think it's worth talking about and not just saying, oh, well, that's how it is. People really did push back on that. That got criticism from the left and the right, and it was a place where people agreed, right, that this isn't the way things should be done. And then, Elizabeth Warren went on Bloomberg News and trash Bloomberg on his station. So a lot of interesting things have happened. So I think we should absolutely use it. But it's symptomatic of a bigger issue about money in politics, money in media, and the interplay between those things. And so I think if it gets a conversation like that going, it's really important. And in our classes, we do talk about that stuff because we talk a lot about ownership, media ownership, and structures, and the way that all of these players interact, and that's just the most recent example, and a really easy one for students to kind of and people to wrap their brain around because it's so blatant.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your presentation. I wonder about the issue of self-censorship. For example, the Press Citizen and the Des Moines Register a while back ran a story about Collins Aerospace working with ICE to track and apprehend immigrants. And then more recently, the New York Times published an article about Collins Aerospace involvement in the Boeing fiasco. Not a word of that in the Gazette. Not a word of it. And so I wonder how that, I'm sure the Gazette is not the only one that sits on stories.
Yeah.
So how are, I mean, we can ferret this out if we look at a lot of different sources. But also, I wonder to what extent this would fall into kind of the domain of what Noam Chomsky talks about when he and a friend wrote a book on manufacturing consent. So I would like your comment on that reality.
Yeah, self-censorship and actual censorship are real, right? So self-censorship would be more like an individual journalist or even a news organization not covering something and saying, quote unquote, it was a choice, right? So this happens actually, your example was a really interesting one, but this is a major global issue. Really, really, really important around the world, particularly in countries in which the media is tightly connected to the ruling parties, right? So being able to criticize presidents, for example, and a lot of what we see here is people they'll say, oh, no, this media is free, it's not censored, but then they self-censor because they'll get fired, for example. But then real censorship, not real, that's real, other kinds of censorship where you choose not to cover a story because it's not in your economic interest, right? Or it's not in your community's economic interest, that's absolutely a real thing. It's been going on for a long time, and I unfortunately don't think that's going away, but it does take these one thing we have going now for us that I think is really powerful is we can see that this story was covered differently by different outlets, and you can then hold your media to account. I absolutely think that is all of our jobs. Don't be mean about it. Don't do it over something silly, but do it over something that matters. If that matters, and it does, write a letter. Tweet about it. Get their attention, because you know what? Then they have to respond. And they may have a perfectly good reason, or they may have a really bad reason. But if media organizations want to be in the game of civic engagement, of saying that they're the best, especially local media, they're the best source for news and information for your community, prove it. Capitalism works both ways. We talk and walk with our dollars too, right? So I think it's really important that we hold our news organizations to account without going overboard. We've gone overboard in some cases where if someone makes an actual mistake, we're saying cancel the paper. Or if they write a headline that you don't like how it's slanted, cancel the paper. No, now you're just contributing to the downfall of journalism, right? So I think absolutely you should call that stuff out. You should do it in an engaged and thoughtful way, and you should ask questions. Again, these folks, most of them are your neighbors in some degree, right? And so if they're invested in the community, they should have an answer. And again, you may not agree with it, but at least that's that transparency question, right? I think it's really important that these news organizations tell us who owns them, who has a stake, why they do certain things. And again, then we can choose to disagree, and at least we're all operating with the same set of information. I think that's something that really bothers us, that we feel like, this bothers me, that we feel like powerful people are doing things behind the scenes that we don't know about, and they don't want us to know, and therefore we can't engage in a true dialogue. So when you see stuff like that, I would absolutely say get involved and call it out.
I was just going to say that it seems as those that peddle the biggest fantasies and conspiracy theories make the most money, and I'll just mention Hannity.
Mm-hmm. You are not wrong.
So there's a lot of money to be made, I guess. There's a lot of money to be made because I'm sure Hannity makes a lot of money.
There is a ton of money to be made. That's why I was talking about revenue models earlier. There are digital revenue models, but there are just old school advertising revenue models, eyeballs on screens, and 100% things that get us mad, things that get us fired up, things that, again, contribute to what we already believe, right? The confirmation bias. Those things tend to also make money. So 100%. And again, conspiracy theories are not just the realm of the right. They are the realm of all sides. Right now, we're living in a world in which right-wing conspiracy theories are the ones that are top of mind and the ones that are making money and getting in front of us. It is not by accident that things move from the fringe right to Fox News with the speed that we have never seen before. It used to be, and this isn't that long ago, is not that long ago, where those fringe ideas actually were pushed away, even by something as partisan, right? But now those ideas are getting scooped because you're to be cynical, right? It's all about money, but also it's about ginning up support, ginning up your base, telling those people, we hear you, we see you, we want your vote. And that's a real thing for both sides. It's just right now, I think it's happening in an unprecedented way on the right.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about what you do your work in East Africa?
Yeah, sure. So
Thank you.
I just came back from Kenya, actually. I was there this summer. So most of my work there has been on with folks in Nairobi, so in the capital, younger Kenyans and how they use digital and social media for political engagement, civic engagement, calling out their media, calling out, their politicians. And what I'm doing right now is looking at some of these issues of misinformation and news and media literacy in Kenya. So what strategies do Kenyans have for making sense of their media environment? And that role of what I was talking about with WhatsApp. So it's huge there. So there are tons of these groups on WhatsApp, and we can't see them, we being the public, right? Because it's closed. So as researchers, we don't know what's going on in those spaces, what kinds of things are being circulated, what kind of effects they're having. So I'm starting to look into that, how folks in countries in which they use much more closed chat apps and sort of have more closed conversations where kinship ties are a little bit different, things like that, how information spreads there, and the difference, there's a lot of differences between the United States and Kenya, but political differences, the way their partisanship manifests, it's very different than ours, but it's there. And so I've been looking at sort of that information flows and the strategies and tactics that people have for doing the kinds of things that I was just talking about.
Help me to thank Melissa Tully, please.
Thank you.
Fantastic information. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you will return when we are in a new year.